The lights came on behind me without warning. Red and blue filled the rearview mirror in a steady pattern that left no room for interpretation. I eased off the accelerator and guided my car onto the shoulder. Gravel clicked under the tires as I brought the vehicle to a clean stop. Straight and controlled. The engine stayed running. I rolled all 4 windows down and placed the keys on the dashboard. Metal catching the light. My hands settled on the wheel at 10 and 2. I waited. The patrol car stayed tight behind me. Engine idling. The officer didn't come straight to my door. He stepped out slowly. In the side mirror, I caught the stitched name above his pocket as he moved. Officer Kyle Bennett. His body camera was on. A red light blinked at a steady pace. He still hadn't said what this stop was for. No reason stated. He walked the passenger side first, leaning slightly to look through the open windows. Front seat, back seat, floorboards. He didn't rush it. He took his time. The interior was clean. Nothing loose. Nothing hidden. Nothing to comment on. When he reached the rear of the car, he dragged a finger through the dust on the trunk lid, drawing a long line across the paint. He didn't wipe it away. He left the line in the dust and walked on. Only then did he come to my window. He stopped just behind the door pillar, a position that kept most of his body out of my view unless I turned my head. I kept my eyes forward. License and insurance. My documents are in the glove compartment. I said, I'm going to reach for them. He watched my hands closely as I opened the glove box and removed the folder. Everything inside was arranged and visible. I handed it out. He took the license but didn't look at it right away. Instead, his attention drifted back to the inside of the car. The seats, the dashboard, the empty cup holders. He let the pause linger longer than necessary. This is a nice car, he said. Thank you. He turned the license over in his fingers. Still not reading it. What do you do for work? I work for the county. He gave a brief smile that didn't reach his face. The county is doing what? I work for the county. That was all I offered. I didn't add detail. I didn't justify anything. I stayed where I was. Hands steady? Posture unchanged. He stepped back and scanned the road, then leaned in again. Do you know why I stopped you? No. You were weaving. I was maintaining my lane. He paused. The space between us tightened. He leaned closer. Close enough that I could hear his breathing. He took 2 slow breaths through his nose. Deliberate and audible. I smell marijuana, he said. Clear and deliberate. Like he wanted the camera to have it. You do not, I said. There has never been smoking in this vehicle. Step out of the car. I unbuckled my seatbelt. The click echoed in the quiet. I opened the door and stepped onto the shoulder. Turn around. Hands on the hood. I placed my palms on the metal. The heat pressed into my skin. I spread my feet and stood still. He moved in behind me and kicked my heel outward to widen my stance. He kept his hands moving, quickly over my sides and waistband. He removed my wallet and phone and placed them on the hood. Don't move. I didn't. He walked back to my car and opened the driver's door. From the reflection in the windshield, I watched him start pulling things out. Floor mats onto the dirt. The center console emptied. Pens rolled across the seat. A small tin of mints popped open, scattering across the floor. Nothing he touched was noted. Nothing was said into the camera. Minutes passed. The search became faster, less methodical. Back seat. Under the seats. The glove box again. Papers placed on the floor. The interior that had been clean and orderly was now scattered. The disruption left where it fell. He found nothing. Then he went to the trunk. Open it. I don't consent to a search. I have probable cause. I pressed the key fob. The trunk opened with a soft mechanical sound. A black duffel bag sat in the center. He grabbed it and pulled the zipper back in one hard motion. His hand stopped. He froze, then glanced at the blinking red light on his chest. Inside was my uniform, folded neatly. My duty belt rested beside it. The weight, familiar. Me, radio. My handcuffs. And on top, catching the light as the trunk stood open. My badge? The nameplate was clear. Marcus Reed. He didn't speak. He didn't reach further into the bag. I turned around. "Call a supervisor," I said. My voice stayed level. It didn't need to rise. That was the moment the stop stopped being his. When he stepped back from the trunk, he didn't close it. The lid stayed raised. The duffel bag remained open. My uniform was still visible where it lay, folded and undisturbed. The badge caught the light each time the breeze shifted the trunk slightly on its hinges. The red indicator on his chest camera kept blinking. Steady. Indifferent. For a moment, nothing happened. He stood there, facing the open trunk, long enough for the pause itself to become part of the stop. Not long enough to explain anything. Just long enough to register that the sequence had broken. Then he straightened and reached for his radio. He keyed his mic and asked for a supervisor. He gave his unit number. His voice sounded different now. Lower. Flatter. He didn't narrate what had happened. The request went out without context. I stayed where I was. My hands were no longer on the hood. But I didn't step away from the vehicle. No one told me I was free to go. I wasn't released. And nothing had been stated on the record. The patrol car idled behind us. Traffic moved past. No instruction came. While we waited, he started putting the car back together. Not carefully. Not fully. He picked up the floor mats and dropped them back inside without shaking the dirt loose. He scooped the papers from the glove box and pushed them back into place. Corners bent now where they hadn't been before. He didn't bother with the mints. They stayed scattered across the floor. Small white dots against the dark carpet. None of this was mentioned in the camera. He avoided looking at me. When he did glance over, it was brief. His posture stayed rigid, shoulders square. His hands are close to his belt. He stayed where he was. He didn't advance. Minutes passed with no instruction. The trunk was still open. The badge was still visible. The camera was still recording. Eventually, another vehicle pulled in behind the patrol car. A marked SUV. Different lights. Different stance. It stopped at a measured distance, not crowding the scene. A man stepped out. Older. Heavier. His movements economical. Sergeant David Miller. According to the patch on his sleeve. He didn't look at me first. He went to Officer Kyle Bennett. They spoke quietly. Heads angled toward each other. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the sequence. The sergeant looked at the open trunk, then at the duffel bag, then at the badge, then back at Bennett. He walked toward me. "Marcus," he said. "Yes, sir." He nodded once. No surprise in it. Just confirmation. He turned back toward Bennett and began asking questions. Why was the stop initiated? When that reason had been stated, when probable cause had been articulated, what had been found during the search, each question came one at a time. Each waited for an answer before the next followed. Bennett didn't talk the way he had earlier. He answered briefly, sometimes after a pause, sometimes with a single phrase. The sergeant reached up and tapped Bennett's body camera once, not to turn it off, just to acknowledge that it was there and running. Then he told him to step back to his unit. Bennett moved away from the trunk and stopped beside his patrol car. He stayed there. The sergeant stayed with me. Not close. Not far. He told me I was being detained pending review. He didn't say why I had been stopped. He didn't say the stop was justified. He stated the status and nothing more. That status didn't give me my time back. It didn't give me my freedom. It didn't undo what had already happened. By the time it became a logged incident, I had already been held and searched. The trunk was closed. The duffel bag was left as it was. The interior of the car stayed disturbed. No attempt was made to restore it. The sergeant spoke into his radio. Unit numbers. Location. Time. Dispatch acknowledged. From that point, it ran through the supervisor and dispatch. When he told me I could step away from the vehicle, it wasn't an order. It was a procedural shift. I moved slowly, standing off to the side while he continued speaking into the radio. Bennett remained by his patrol car. He didn't approach. He didn't interrupt. He waited. I wasn't free to leave. Not yet. The wait continued. And this time, it had a file number. The supervisor didn't rush anything. He stood between the two vehicles, far enough from both to keep the scene balanced. The next steps were no longer handled at the roadside. He spoke into his radio again. Short transmission. Unit numbers. A brief status update. Go ahead. Dispatch replied. That was it. No commentary. No question. Just an acknowledgement that the line was now open in the system. Officer Kyle Bennett stayed by his patrol car. He didn't approach again. He didn't reposition himself closer to me or the trunk. His hands rested at his sides. The stance that had driven the stop earlier was gone. What remained was waiting. Sergeant David Miller turned back toward me. You're being detained pending review, he said. I nodded once. There was nothing to add. He didn't explain what the review would look like. He didn't offer reassurance. He didn't say the stop was justified or unjustified. He stated the status and let it stand. While he handled the radio traffic, I stepped back toward my car. I didn't touch anything inside. The interior was still disturbed. Papers sat where they had been dropped. The floor mats were out of alignment. The mints were scattered across the carpet. Nothing was restored at the scene. A few minutes passed. No instructions came. The trunk was closed now, but the bag inside hadn't been moved. The badge was no longer visible, but the moment it had been seen didn't disappear with the lid coming down. Eventually, the sergeant returned. You're free to go, he said. Not because the stop had been resolved, not because it had been justified, but because the roadside portion was finished. I got into the driver's seat and closed the door. The engine was still running. The air conditioning still pushed cool air into the cabin. I sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel, waiting for the signal that meant the sequence was actually complete. Then I pulled back onto the road. In the rear-view mirror, I saw Bennett still standing by his unit. He didn't follow. He didn't move. The supervisor remained nearby, speaking into his radio again. Steady and unremarkable. That was the last moment of the stop. What followed didn't happen on the shoulder. The footage was reviewed. Not immediately, but quickly enough. It was reviewed by people who weren't there. People who hadn't heard the tone in real time or felt the heat off the hood of the car. They didn't need that context. They only needed the order of events. The sequence didn't line up. The reason for the stop came after the stop. The justification came after the search. The record arrived after the discretion had already been exercised. That discrepancy remained in the file. Officer Kyle Bennett was relieved of duty pending investigation. His badge was taken. His weapon was secured. There was no announcement made at the roadside. No public confrontation. The process moved forward quietly, the way internal procedures usually do. The footage was preserved. It wasn't edited. It wasn't buried. It was reviewed again. Then again, each time by someone further removed from the scene. Eventually, it became part of training. In a classroom far from the highway, new recruits watched it later. The video paused at specific moments. The initial stop, the unanswered reason, the radio call, the bag in the trunk. They weren't asked what Bennett intended. They weren't asked what he felt. They were asked one question. What happened first? The answer didn't change. I went back to work. Not immediately. There were statements to give, forms to sign, follow-up conversations that took place indoors, at desks, under fluorescent lights. Everything moved more slowly than it had on the roadside. But it moved. For the record, I said during one of those conversations, I was detained before a reason was stated. The note was taken. The lines stayed in the file. The car was eventually cleaned. The floor mats were shaken out. The mints were thrown away. The papers went back where they belonged. None of that changed what had already been logged. And it wasn't meant to. The stop didn't end with raised voices or handcuffs on the shoulder. It ended with the procedure running as written. When power operates without record, it feels temporary. When the record arrives later, it constrains what follows. If you pay attention to how authority works before it's written down, if you care about what happens in the gap between discretion and documentation, follow power abuse stories. These moments don't announce themselves. They unfold in sequence, and they only make sense once the record finally arrives.